has been part of the COMPASS study since before the grant writing. She was involved in some of the initial thinking and feedback to the clinicians here at Wake Forest, where her husband, a physician here at the medical center, was treated after his stroke. She is a retired middle school teacher, and she often credits her ability to advocate due to her position as a middle school teacher. She's been a very fierce advocate for Dr. Celestino during his recovery, and in particular while he was working through aphasia. So Joan has been heavily involved in training our post-acute care teams at the intervention sites. And she was such a hit that when the control sites switch over to implementing COMPASS, you will meet her in person as well. And she's also been very involved in developing the handouts that we have created for providers on communication, how to communicate with patients after they've suffered a stroke. And so one thing we have learned in sort of our listening to stakeholders throughout the study design is that everybody has a different perspective. And one thing that our stroke survivors highlighted very, very quickly was that currently the standard of care tends to forget family members and doesn't support them the way they need to be supported. They are sort of worn out in their caregiving duties. In many cases, they themselves are elderly or of poor health, and taking on the responsibility of caring for a spouse is tremendous. And it was our stroke survivors that brought our attention to family members much more clearly than family members did. Our family members were constantly focused on the patient's needs, and the patients were the ones that kept saying, don't forget my caregiver, don't forget my caregiver. It's actually in my best interest if you also support my caregiver. And so, Joan, why don't you just share briefly your thoughts on why it's so important to care. I know that you are a loud advocate for patients, but also for other caregivers across North Carolina. If you could highlight for all the members on the call why it's so important that we capture the caregiver's perspective in our survey as part of the study design.
Well, I think my husband and I had probably a different picture than some others. We were fairly healthy right at about 60 years old, and my husband coughed too hard, had bilateral dissection of his carotids, and they were happily able to save his life, but he did have a stroke. And from the point that happened, for quite a few months, even though he understood what was going on slowly, and he began to get his ability to move back, he was not able to control his rehabilitation. He had to have somebody strong who could see what was going on and move towards the determination that he could then produce. And so I think when we think about people with stroke being discharged from the hospital or from rehab, and they come home, their success is maybe at the very beginning totally in the hands of their caregivers, because the caregiver is the one who makes sure that the medicine regimen is followed. They make sure that they get to the rehab things they need to do. They need to be right there for them to make sure any physical practice or occupational therapy, the practice is done at home. So it's really at that beginning part, really for the first 3 months, it is totally who is driving the rehab. And that is something that is sometimes missed. Certainly, the patient should be the center of everything. But what happens is the patient often doesn't really know how to organize all of that. And so I think what's happening is there is a drop from the caregivers, from the hospital caregivers, between that and the actual family caregiver. Now, in our situation, I was teaching middle school. I was happily able to find a couple of sort of underemployed people in my church, and they came and were with my husband while he needed somebody 24/7, and then I came home from my job and continued it. But the determination to succeed really came from me. And so it is critical that anybody talking about stroke realizes that the support and the resources at the beginning need to be really fully behind the caregiver. And, you know, as we've gone along, my husband has now done wonderfully. He happily talks about his golf game approaching, at least he's under 90 now, and so he's very pleased with that. But the major thing is now he can have goals and drive that. But at the beginning, it was in my hands. So, Sabina, do you want me to?
Yes. And so I know at the beginning he was told he wouldn't be playing golf again. And so you've come such a tremendous way. And I do want to highlight, this is something Joan has said herself, that she and her husband were in a unique position compared to most families, and that they were highly educated and had high income and access to resources that most people probably didn't have. And despite those advantages, it's a tremendous burden to overcome. And one last person who said this to me is the Betsy Vetter, who's the head of governmental affairs for the American Heart Association here in North Carolina. And she is probably one of the most resourced, knowledgeable people around stroke. And when she was faced with having to care for her husband after his stroke, she said she was completely overwhelmed. And so you have these highly motivated, highly engaged, highly resourced individuals who are overwhelmed. And so when you consider the average family, the burden can truly seem overwhelming.
And you mentioned this before, but also the health of the caregiver, in addition to the health of the patient, is terrifically important.
Yes, and so this is why when we intervene through the Compass intervention, an element of assessing comprehensively how the patient is doing is pivoting to the caregiver and going through a battery of questions with them to understand what their needs are to care for the patient, because just exactly as you said, Joan, they're really driving rehab initially.
Joan, do you have any other thoughts you want to share about the importance of having the nurses and the hospital staff, touch base with the caregivers?
Well, I think that stroke is a devastating condition, and to recover from it requires a tremendous amount of hope and determination. And it is always everybody's goal to infuse that into the stroke survivor. But it is critical that somebody help get that into the caregiver as well. And I think that the medical community is is really too afraid to give hope. And I think that it's the only way caregivers can go on is if they think there is hope. And so they need to understand where somebody might be able to move and how they will be able to move forward. And also the idea that improvement after stroke can go on for years and years and years. So my husband is now 4.5 years out, and he has pretty good movement, but his hand was still a little bent. Well, he decided he'd go to acupuncture. And, that's now improved. And at each stage, we visit people and they say, you are so much better than you were last year. So his attitude is his attitude of what he can do and how it will be in the future is totally defined by the recognition that improvement continues. And so I think that that's a critical aspect of dealing with the stroke survivors, but also with the caregivers themselves.
One thing we do wanted to highlight, right, was that it's necessary to get the caregiver survey completed, because what makes Compass unusual is that it's assessing the needs of the family member caring for the patient in addition to the patient, and so we want, it's our secondary outcome, that we reduced family strain through the Compass intervention, and so it's absolutely important that we get the surveys that we're mailing out to patients across the state, to the families across the state, returned to us in a higher rate than has happened so far. But we should turn the phone over to Barb, too.